Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, I am going to be making a gathered skirt. I think this is a pretty simple style to make, pretty straightforward, and it's a very comfortable skirt to wear. It can also give shape and I guess like the illusion of curves. If you're more narrow around the hip area and you want to create a curvier look, a gathered skirt can give you that because it has gathers or pleats around the hip area, around the waist, falling down into the hips. Very flowy, comfortable, lots of space to move around in. So it's one of my favorites to make. So what I'm doing is just cutting the fabric. Now this fabric measures 24 inches, measures 42 inches wide. That is the width of the fabric, and I'm going to be using the entire width of that to accommodate my hips. So when you're doing a gathered skirt, the measurement on the top edge, which would typically be considered the waist, needs to be enough to go up over your hips once it's gathered. Okay. Now it's 42 inches wide, and I'm going to have two pieces, which means it's going to be 84 wide. My hips are not 84, but once I gather it down to my hip measurement, that's kind of what I'm showing here, and then add elastic or sew it up, it's going to come up. There will probably be like 1 inch of room or ease in the waist area to go up over my hips. So you don't have to use the entire width of fabric. You don't have to make it 42 inches wide each piece. If you didn't want to have as many gathers as a full piece, the width of the original fabric would be, you can cut, I would say like take like 10 inches off of that. So if I was going to create a skirt for a finished hip measurement of 40 and each of my pieces is measuring 42 inches wide, that means my finished hips is going to be 84. I would go down, or I could cut off maybe like 10 inches of that width. And that way when I gathered it up, there wouldn't be as many pleats or gathers, if that makes sense. So if I cut off 10 from 42, that will give me 32. And then I'm just gathering each piece up to about 20 or 21 inches. And I won't have as many pleats. And it won't be as full at the waist as it would be if I use the entire width of the fabric 42. So you can play around with how wide you want your piece to be, depending on how many gathers and pleats you want. For this one, I'm just going to go with the full width of fabric. And what you've been watching me do here is just cut my pieces and get them marked. I just folded my fabric over and cut like both pieces I need at once. It's just kind of my way of making things more efficient and going a little bit faster. And then I like to, whenever I'm doing a gathered skirt, I like to go ahead and mark my seam allowances and sometimes the line up to which I'm going to be gathering. So typically we're doing a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I will go ahead and mark 5/8 inch. Now I'm not going to sew my gather line directly on that 5/8 inch line. I'm going to sew it just a little bit above, and I'll talk a little bit about that later when I begin to sew. And right here you just see me showing you how it's gonna
All
look
right,
once it's
so
gathered up.
I am about to assemble the skirt. Well, first I'm about to sew the rows of stitching to do the gathering. I did go ahead and decide to put pockets in the skirt. Here's one of the pockets right here. But I wanted to show you, let me fix my camera, what we're gonna do. So when you're doing gathering, you can sew either 2 rows of stitching or 3. I usually do 3 if I'm going to do gathering for a garment, but today I'm only going to do 2. Now, we already drew the seam allowance lines, which are going to be helpful in the placement of the stitching. Of course, you don't have to draw these lines, but they can be helpful. I usually don't. I just kind of eyeball it, but for the purpose of showing you, I want to go ahead and draw the line. So I've drawn them here in white. And I've also marked over here, you can't really see it now because I put the pocket in, but 5/8 inches from this edge as well. when you are sewing rows of stitches, you do not begin at the very end of the fabric. So I won't start like at the edge here. I will start at the 5/8 mark because that's the seam allowance I'm going to be using. If you're using a bigger or smaller seam allowance, you just begin from the edge of the fabric, this edge over here, across. You just begin wherever your seam allowance begins. So for me, I'll start about right here, 5/8, and I'm going to sew rows of stitching all the way down. Now, I am not going to sew my first row of stitching on my seam allowance. So that's why this line can be helpful. I don't want to sew it on top of that line because I want it to be concealed when I add my waistband. I don't want rows of stitching showing down here on my skirt when it's done. So what I'm going to do is sew right above this seam allowance line. So not at 5/8, but just a bit above that. And I'm going to sew a row all the way down. And then above that row of stitching, maybe about 1/4 of an inch, either from this top down or from the line that I'm going to initially sew, I'll sew another row of stitching. And those will be my lines for gathering. Now, what's important? Okay, I need to change my stitch length. I need it to be like a basting stitch, to be, a long stitch. So right now I'm sewing on 9, and I'm using my Brother machine and not the Genome machine right now. Usually I'm doing like 8 or 9 for my stitch, but today I am going to change this to 10. So it's going to create for a longer stitch, which will be easier to pull and gather up the fabric. This can also be done by hand. Of course, it takes longer, but you can also do basting stitches by hand and gather up your skirt. Today I'm going to be sewing on 10, and that will, as I said, make it easier to gather the skirt. And I'm using this white thread on purpose just so that you can see it. Typically I'd be using brown thread to match the brown fabric, but this is for educational purposes. So I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. All right, so I changed my setting to 10. I am going to go over to my, I guess the inside of my seam allowance, my 5/8, and start there. I'm not going to start at the edge. And that's because when I sew my seams together, when I finish sewing this, I'm going to gather up the skirt and then tie off the ends. I don't want that gathering stitch to be in my seam allowance. I need it to be over here on the skirt. So I'm going to kind of move up a little bit above my seam allowance as I explained a moment ago, and I am going to begin stitching. So basically I have the edge of my presser foot on that white line that I drew, and that can kind of be my guide to let me know I don't need to be sewing directly on the white line, but above it. So you can do that, or you can just kind of eyeball it and see where you need to be sewing. So I have my presser foot down, I'm going to put my needle down, and I'm going to just sew all the way across this fabric. Now you can see this is already gathering on its own because this fabric is very thin and my stitch length is longer, so that's causing it to already automatically gather up. So that's going to be a little bit helpful. If I had a sturdier fabric, it wouldn't be doing that, but this is just a very thin cotton fabric. This might be a cotton blend, actually. Okay, now I'm getting to the end, and again I'm going to stop before I get to the edge of the fabric. So I'm gonna I marked a white line to let me know where my seam allowance is, so I'm just going to sew right up to that line and stop. And do not backstitch. That's another thing I should mention. When you're gathering, you don't do a backstitch at the beginning or the end. Okay, lift the presser foot, lift the needle, and pull this out. Now I want to leave a few inches for gathering, so I won't cut it off so short. I'll leave it about, I guess, like 2 inches long, and I'm gonna just go ahead and cut both of those off. And you see this is already gathering up by itself, but I'm gonna gather it the rest of the way. But something I'm forgetting is that I want to sew another row of stitching on this, right? So I only did one, and the way that it's looking, I really could probably get away with one because it's already semi-gathered. But as I said, your fabric may not be like this. So you go ahead and do at least 2 rows of stitching and then gather. So I did that one row, and I'm going to do another row just above this one that I did. So just right up there. See if I can ungather this a little bit because I kind of want it to be straight. You know, if you're in a bind and you want to just, and you have fabric that's thin like this and it's already pre-gathering itself, and you want to just go ahead and let that be, hey, I'm not going to say I've never done that before. 1 row of stitching, but for the purpose of this video, I'll go ahead and sew 2. But I must get this ungathered first because I don't want to be sewing pleats into my fabric. Now the danger of this is that I'm going to end up taking all these gathers out, and then my tail isn't going to be long enough. So what I probably should have done is made this even longer. Like I probably should have made this 5 or 6 inches longer, but that's okay. I'm going to get this like ungathered as much as possible and sew a 2nd row of stitching. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start sewing the 2nd row of stitching above my first one. I can do the same thing. I can line my presser foot edge up with this 1st row of stitching and just go across. So I'll do that. I have enough seam allowance space left here to do that. Maybe just a little bit closer though. Okay, so I've sewn my 2nd row of stitching here. You can see the 2 rows in there, spaced a bit apart. Be sure not to sew on top of each other, sew them on top of each other. And then what I'm going to do now is gather. And as I mentioned, I'm going to gather this long piece, which is about 42 inches. Okay, so I want my finished skirt to be 45 inches before I put the elastic in, which is going to draw it up some more because I'm using elastic and not a zipper. My total measurement all around is I think I said 80, but let's say 84 because 42 plus 42, so 84. And I need to gather this to 45. Well, I need this piece to be half of 45, which is 23, 22 and a half, 22 and a half. Okay, so I'm going to gather this piece up to be 22 and a half inches, and I'll just keep measuring as I go along gathering, and when I get to 22 and a half, excluding the seam allowances, I'll stop. And the way that I'm going to do this is, okay, this is the top of my skirt. This is my pocket over here, which I'll sew together with the other piece in a moment. But when gathering, you're going to have your 2 top threads and your 2 bottom threads, or your bobbin threads. Because when you're sewing on your machine, you have your top thread, which makes these stitches here, and then the bottom thread down in the bobbin, which makes the bottom threads. You want to pull the bobbin threads together, okay? So on the wrong side of the fabric, I am going to start pulling these 2 threads, the bobbin threads, and I am just going to gather. As I said, the fabric will determine kind of how this goes. As you saw, my fabric had already begun to gather on its own, but a sturdier fabric won't necessarily do that. So I'm just gathering. I'm holding the 2 bobbin threads and I'm pulling the fabric along the threads, basically is what I'm doing. And even though this fabric is thin, it's not gathering as easily as it seems like it would. So I want to be very gentle, because one thing I don't want to do is break my threads. I want to have a continuous row of stitching all the way across for the gathering process. If I pull too hard, or just make a mistake, I could snap the thread like right here in the middle, and then that's gonna like break the chain, for gathering. But there's a way to fix that too. Let's just hope we don't have to do it. So I'm just gonna gather, and then I'll measure to see when I get to 22.5 inches. And you can gather from both ends. So what I'm gonna do is just start on this side and maybe gather like to a midpoint and then go to my other end and gather from that side as well. Try to keep things even. And I'm using my fingernail here to kind of do it. That's what's making that noise, but just gentle. And gathers will make, you know, it'll produce a full skirt. It'll be like one of those nice full skirts that you see. I'm gonna try to go all the way like to here, and then I'll start from this end down here. So let's get these gathers moved over some more. And then after I do this little piece here, I'm gonna measure and see where I am. Because if I pass 22.5, I'll have to ungather basically. So let's go ahead and measure and see what we have. So let's see what this is doing. I'm going to measure from the edge of my seam allowance, so not all the way at the edge of the fabric, but over here where I started gathering, where I started stitching the rows of gathering. And let's see where we are. Okay, so I am at 23 inches. And I said I wanted to do 22.5. So I don't have much more to gather actually. So what that means is I'm going to go ahead and start pulling from the other end down to 22.5, and then I'm going to have to spread these gathers out because I'm already, doesn't take long, you know, depending on how wide your fabric is when you start. Okay, so that might do it. You know, if you're a petite person, your hips will be smaller. If you're bigger, you know, it'll be the measurement will be bigger, but just do whatever you need. You just need to be able to pull this skirt up over your hips. So now what I'm having to do is take some of my gathers out because I have gathered too much, okay? And part of that is because my fabric had already gathered on its own when you saw when I was sewing. So I need to just undo some gathers here. I just measured, it was about 19. And I'm going for 22.5. Oh, now I'm back at 23. So you see I'm just going back and forth, back and forth. See how much that is. Try to go for 22.5 to almost. Yeah, that's pretty close down here, 22.5. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I don't know if you can see. And then I am going to adjust my gather. So now that I'm done gathering, I need to tie off my ends, right? Because I don't want my gathers to come undone. I've got the right measurement and I'm good. So I have these 2 top threads and I have 2 bottom threads. I am going to pull on the bobbin threads a bit to make the loop in fabric. If you can see, where's the camera? Oh, okay. If I'm pulling them, there's like a little loop forming, and that's basically the top thread under here trying to come through, and that's what I want. So I'm gonna pull that thread through for both of these stitch lines over here, and pull that on through. And now as you can see, there's no longer tails on this side. There's no longer fabric tails on this side. They're all back here. And I am going to tie them together. So I'm going to take the 2 on the bottom row of stitching and tie together, and then the 2 on the top, and I'm going to tie them into knots. Okay, and then I'm going to clip off all this extra. and just leave a small little tail instead of this long one that I currently have. Okay, so here are my 2 rows of stitching, knotted and tied. Just make sure you can see it right there. And then the front side of my fabric here, you don't see any more tails. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so I did the same thing on the other side, and these threads come from the pocket, so ignore that. But here are my 2 knots up here, and the front side has no thread tails. All right, so this is gathered. I just need to spread my gathers out. You can see it's gathered a lot down here, then down here it gets a little more loose, not as gathered. So let's just try to make it even. And now that I've done the ends and did the knots on each end, I don't have to worry about my gathers like coming out completely. Like I don't have to worry about this getting back straight, but I do need to spread some of these gathers down the row. And you see I had something happen right here. Yep, my thread broke. My thread broke. So on the back side, you can see the stitching is out. And so this, this comes up. So in my videos, I like to show you kind of what to do if you have these kinds of mistakes. I'm gonna pull these. I'm gonna go ahead and do kind of a similar thing here that I did on the ends. Pull the top thread through to the back. But let's see which thread broke. Looks like my bobbin thread broke, so it's not as long to tie the ends to tie together now. But I am going to pull these through and do a similar tying thing off, and then I'm just going to sew some more rows of stitching right here. Okay, now this took me a while because I kept having to go down the line to get a piece that was long enough to tie together for the top row of stitching. But you can see I've kind of done the same thing on the edge here that I did on the end down here before it snapped. And now I have this stretch of fabric that has no gathers in it, and I'm just going to sew 2 rows, gather it up, tie it off here and here. Now, something that I didn't do initially, typically when I sew rows of stitching for gathering, I sew on the male person is out there. I sew on the wrong side of the fabric so that the bobbin threads that I pull are on the right side. And it's just kind of easier to deal with, I guess. I didn't do that initially, but I'm going to do that this time. So I'll sew on the wrong side of the fabric and start where my seam allowance is from the edge, and then sewing on the same stitch lines that I can see here, and go all the way down and do 2 rows, not back stitching at the beginning. And I sewed right up to my other stitching that broke earlier, like this. So I have a new row of stitching in here, and you can see the ends are here and they meet up with this row of stitching here. So I'll do the same thing. I'll sew another row right here. Okay, so I've done 2 new rows of stitching here, and I'm just going to gather them up and tie them off. Okay, so this piece is done. It is gathered. I've done the gathers. I've spaced them out as much as I can. Didn't want to pop my thread again. I was a little bit nervous about that. So I think it looks pretty good. It's measuring 22.5, which is what I need. And I'm going to repeat this process on the other piece, and then we will assemble the skirt. Now this time I will remember to sew on the wrong side of the fabric so that my rows that I'm gathering are on the right side. but as you see, it works either way. And even though I did do my white line on here, it's already rubbed away. So what you can do if you don't have the marking is on my, let's see if you can even see here. I have on my machine, I have my 5/8 line is right here, and sometimes I can't, like it's better for me to have it marked. So I have a little black mark right there. Line is here, and I've marked a little permanent black line. And so what I'm going to do when sewing my rows of stitches is have my fabric edge below my 5/8 mark, so that on here I'm not sewing on the seam allowance, right? So if I have this up all the way on my 5/8, that means I'll be sewing on the 5/8 line, and I don't want that. I want to sew just above the 5/8 line, okay? Okay, so I gathered up my other piece of fabric, and now I have two. And by the way, I didn't have any problems with this one. None of my threads snapped. I got my gathering done, and I actually gathered it to 22.5 on the first try, which was great. And so now it's time to assemble the skirt. So that's essentially it for the gathering part. Once you get it done and the ends tied, you can put your pieces together. Just ensure, the things with this is just making sure that you gather up to the measurements that you need to go over your hips. So if you have two pieces that are 42 each, that's 84 inches total around. If your hip measurement is 40, then each of your pieces needs to basically just gather to 20, I'll say 21 inches. You don't need 80 inches around, right? So that's kind of the main thing, getting the measurements correct and doing the gathering and trying to not snap your threads as you gather. And if you do, just kind of knowing how to repair and kind of make up for that like I had to do on the first piece. So now I'm going to go ahead and assemble this, and then I'll show you the finished skirt. And let me mention, I'm going to turn my stitch length back to 9. So remember that we're no longer using a basting stitch or a long stitch. So you need to go back to your normal setting for that, for the stitching. Okay, so I've done that. Okay, so here is the final skirt. I have a gathered skirt here with pockets and a waistband that has elastic. As I mentioned, I mentioned during the video that I use white thread just so you will be able to see it better, but typically I would use matching thread. I don't recall why I did the waistband this way. I just laid it on top of the waist of the skirt and sewed it down with some elastic. There was some specific reason I did that I don't remember, because I'm recording this in October and this footage is actually from June or July. So it's taking me that long and I can't remember everything. But the pockets are really nice, and yeah, so it's a pretty full skirt, has a lot of gathers, a lot of shape and body. I think some people avoid gathered skirts if they already have like wide hips, but that's up to you, like whatever you I think looks good on your body or the body of whoever you're sewing this for. But gathered skirts are fun. I enjoy making them. So hope this video was helpful and giving you some tips on making a gathered skirt. Thanks so much for watching.